Good evening, I'm Larry Lorenz. A tempest hit town this week, not out of the Gulf, but from two news organizations that reinvestigated the political side of Tulane scholarships. We'll take a look. We'll also discuss one planner's visions for the city, the latest in the Danziger case, the psychology of crime, and the language of hurricanes. On to all that are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter for WWL-TV Channel 4. Tyler Bridges, reporter for The Lens. Gordon Russell, managing editor for investigations of the New Orleans Advocate. And Errol, Tulane scholarships given by legislators were the news again this week, thanks to WWL-TV and the Advocate. What was the background for that?
Well, first, there's two media stories behind this. One is that this is probably the first example. I mean, there have been examples of Advocate stories appearing on Channel 4 and Channel 4 stories appearing in the Advocate, but I think it's the first time that two reporters, one from each outlet, worked together on the story. So this is something I'm not sure if we've seen in New Orleans journalism before, where we have a TV reporter and a newspaper reporter working on the same story. So this is another step in the wacky world of journalism as it changes. But the other thing I just wanted to point out is that this particular story, I could tell you when it broke. It broke on Friday, May 28, 1993. And the reason what happened is that early that week there had been a graduation at Brother Martin High School, and Mayor Bartholomew announced that he was giving a Tulane scholarship to his son. Now, people have been knowing for years about political people being able to give Tulane scholarships. I knew about it. I mean, I thought everybody knew about it, and there was no real sense of outrage. But something happened that somebody was there and called Channel 4, and it was Eric Paulson who got it and decided to do a story about it. So this would have been on a Friday. That afternoon, a barge hit the Judge Sieber Bridge. And early in the day, there were announcements, people saying around town that hundreds of people had been killed. It sounded like a huge disaster. So that evening, a lot of people turned on television to see what happened with the Judge Sieber Bridge. As it turns out, there was only one person who was killed and there were 2 injuries. But there was a huge audience, and by the time TV came on, it had been resolved, it wasn't that. And so that story followed that, okay? And so what started off as Sidney Bartholomew's simple announcement was delivered in front of a really big audience, and then it just took off, and that's where and it just had wings beyond, I know, what Eric Paulson never expected, and it just had a life of its own, and people quickly forgot about the Judge Sieber Bridge. By the way, it was just a barge accident, and it was fixed, and so there's two stories here, one in terms of the origins of the current things, but the way another story drove an audience to this story. So.
Errol, you said a lot of people knew that these Tulane scholarships were given out by legislators. What's the background on that? I
think it goes back, and then these guys might know, to the early days of Tulane. I think it was part of the arrangement, some kind of a land arrangement with the state where they would provide scholarships. And you know, it's not unusual to have situations where political people give scholarships or appointments to establishments like the military academies. I mean, for years you get into a military academy by appointments from a congressman, and so that's an unusual situation. That's been around.
What was that, Gordon?
The origin of the program, it started in the 1880s. It was part of a kind of a complicated swap where, and Tyler actually wrote about this back in the original Tulane scholarship scandal 20 years ago. There was a couple of deals confected in the 1880s where Tulane, which was the University of Louisiana at the time, became a private school, and it was supposed to become this sort of prestigious school, sort of a beacon for Louisiana. And as part of this swap, they were given a property tax exemption that's kind of complicated, but it exempted them from some property taxes, and also a sales tax exemption for both state and local sales taxes. And in exchange, they got the campus and whatever was on it at the time. I don't know exactly what was there. And they had this deal where they would admit 144 students every year, awarded scholarships by each legislator in the state, and then an additional 5 students each year awarded scholarships by the mayor. And the mayor's scholarships last for 4 years, and the legislative scholarships last for 1 year, although they're typically re-awarded for each of the 4 years.
The scholarship situation in 1993, the stories put the spotlight on it. How much changed in these 10 years?
Well, so I would say there's been
20 years.
20 years. I would say there's been a lot of change. One of the things that the Times-Picayune really took a hold of this story after WWO broke it 20 years ago, and they exposed all of the different favors that had been cut over the years by different legislators. And there was a lot of public outrage, and the fix that they came up with at the time was that, number one, the names of the recipients would be public, and they're published online each year. They didn't have the internet back then, so I'm not sure what the public part of it was, but they're now published online each year. And there's certain prohibitions, like for instance, you can't take one yourself if you're an elected official, and if you are giving one to a relative of an elected official, you have to disclose that.
Sort of,
right.
As we found out.
We're working on something on that.
But you have to keep in mind that, what made it such a scandal back then, where there were so many prominent politicians whose children were getting these. We had the son of Bob Livingston, John Bro's kid, Senator John Bro. We had Johnny Jackson, the councilman.
Dave Treen's son, I think.
Dave Treen. Johnny Jackson gave one to himself
Right.
to go to graduate school. So all of that added fuel to the fire when that story
Supreme Court
broke.
judges as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I would say that it's changed a lot because those changes shamed a lot of people into not giving them to their, for instance, members of their own family and so forth. I think they can't give them to their own
They
family
can't,
members.
right.
That's right.
And when I did those stories back for the Times-Picayune 20 years ago, I found, my memory is that Tulane was embarrassed by it, but they were kind of happy that the story was becoming public, because I don't think they were very happy with how the program had been working. I don't know what your guys' experience
Well, I think that's right.
this week
And
recently.
Another big change was, I don't know what kind of academic qualifications you had to have, if any, at the time. Now there's a fairly high bar for academics. It may not be that, but you have to be admitted to Tulane, for instance, and you have to have a certain ACT score and a certain rank in your class. So it doesn't just get anyone a free pass into Tulane.
But interestingly enough, where the mayoral scholarship program now includes very stringent guidelines, both in the selection process, with sort of a blue ribbon committee to screen the applicants and forward names on to the mayor, and prohibition on any sons or daughters of appointed or elected officials, the legislative scholarships are pretty wide open, except for the academic standards
Right.
that have to be met.
And immediate family.
And immediate family.
Right.
We found, of course, Walter Reed's son was given a scholarship from Harold Ritchie, the state rep up in Washington Parish.
Walter Reed being the district attorney.
Being the DA in St. Tammany in Washington. So clearly, that box of disclosure on elected officials doesn't mean you can't give it to elected officials. So we found plenty of that.
One thing that jumped out at me, the story, I don't know if others noticed this, was the comment, I think it was by Representative Jeff Arnold, when you guys were dealing with the question, well, why do so few people know about it? And I think it was Jeff Arnold who said that the more people know about it, sort of the more problems that you have as a state representative, because then there are more people who you're going to end up disappointing, because you're only going to give the scholarship to one. It reminded me once about Edwin Edwards telling me that he didn't like to judge beauty contests, because you think, well, you want to be able to award the prize to the winner, but then he made the point that you have to also
A lot of losers.
A lot of losers.
Yeah.
Well, you did show some of these legislators who have shown that they have an ethical sense in terms of giving these out.
Yeah, I mean, we had a bunch of examples in the story. There's probably far more examples than we could give, but there's you see a lot of valedictorians of high schools getting these scholarships. You have certain people who have farmed out to some sort of committee. A couple of legislators use Dollars for Scholars to do their selection for them. I mean, one of the interesting things about this whole program is everybody has their own way of doing it, which is maybe one of the problems with it.
But one thing that was pretty consistent, though, was that each legislator, and that's 144 of them, seemed to have his or her own selection process, whatever it may be. And some were quite
Some
good.
better than others, yeah.
Dan Claytor, who's probably the most outspoken critic, a senator up in Baton Rouge, said he just simply goes by the most objective criteria he could think of, which is the ACT test score and GPA. Whoever makes that the highest in his district gets the award. But once again, there were no guidelines by Tulane, so each legislator came up with his or her own process. Many of them relied on just people who called them. Whoever called first, and maybe it was Walter Reed,
That was how
friend of the legislator, called up, got a scholarship available, sure, here you go.
In that case, he said he didn't get any calls from anybody else. So.
Well, Tyler Bridges, you spent a little bit of time with Press Kabikoff recently, and he laid out a grand plan for reviving New Orleans. Tell us a little bit about it, what he wants to do.
Yeah, I wrote a very long story for the Lens that Press Kabikoff, for those who don't know him, is a local developer. And what he's done is taken some of his own ideas and taken the ideas of others. And he sketched out a vision for downtown New Orleans that he says would transform it. The three elements is the redevelopment of the Iberville housing project. That is actually underway, turning it into nicer housing. And then you jump across Canal Street over to Tulane Avenue, and there you have the former Charity Hospital, which has been vacant since it was shut down after Katrina. And Mayor Landrieu has proposed turning Charity into the new City Hall, moving City Hall from its current location. It's an old building with lots of problems, moving that into the center wing of Charity, because the old Charity building has 3 different wings. And then on the lakeside wing, the mayor is proposing that the Civil District Court, which also, everybody thinks it needs another building, that the judges move into there. But they don't want to move there. They want their own building near City Hall. And then the third wing...
Well, they're right next to City Hall now in the existing structure.
Right. And what Mayor Landrieu has come up with is a plan he's to deal with the objection of the judges that the judicial and the executive branches should be separate. Well, they'd all be in one big building, but they each would have separate entrances. And Kabikoff has come up with a plan to deal with the judge's concern that there would be obstructions in the current floor plan for Charity to add add courtrooms in new space. Then the third part of the Charity plan, this is Kabikoff's idea, would be in the third wing to create a neuroscience facility, particularly dealing with aging issues. And then, so you've got on one side you've got the Iberville plan, you've got Charity, and then Kabikoff is suggesting that if you can get all those pieces together, and there's big ifs there, then on Canal Street there's 2 vacant lots that are used for parking on Upper Canal that could be ripe for retail. People who go out to Jefferson Parish, to Lakeside, or Esplanade Mall, that could be a place where they could do their shopping. So there's a lot of ifs, a lot of big questions. Where would the money come from? The only plan that at this point is tangible, any progress, is the Iberville, but they don't have enough money to finish what they're trying to do there.
And Phil Business has always, though, been working with historic tax credits, and so anything he does has that sort of formula involved in it.
Right, Kabikoff has done very well. Started with the federal fiber mills right after the World's Fair in the warehouse district, and his projects, as you say, have heavy government subsidies, tax credits, just as the people who are proposing to redevelop the World Trade Center building now would do.
Have you heard any reaction to what Kabikoff had to say?
Yeah, we got a lot of reaction to our story, and then other people have done their own stories. I think the business community really likes his idea. I think the mayor has liked some of the elements. Last Friday, the mayor's people, Andy Copeland and Cedric Grant, met with the judges to see if they can come to some sort of agreement. Again, each one wants its own building. Kabikoff, for one, believes that the financing doesn't work for the judges unless they come into Charity, but then Landrieu doesn't know how exactly he would finance what he wants to do there. There are the preservationist crowd. They don't trust Kabikoff. He led the redevelopment of the St. Thomas housing project just upriver from the bridge, particularly the Walmart that was built there, with its cookie cutter design, the huge parking lot. The critics say that has nothing to do with everything that makes New Orleans a wonderful place. And so they're skeptical of what he is trying to do. And there are people who are worrying about the gentrification, particularly in neighborhoods like Bywater, where Kabakov lives, and they are. He's actually become in certain ways a lightning rod for criticism among these folks.
There are also a lot of people who wouldn't want to take away that Walmart. At the same time, it's been very successful, especially where it is, where it kind of juts out along the river. It's not like it's in the middle of a neighborhood somewhere. So.
Well, Mike, hardly a day goes by without a shooting in New Orleans, usually by a young person. Has anyone explained what goes on in their heads, what the psychology of this is?
Well, sadly, this is a topic we've raised on Informed Sources many times, and it seems to be getting worse instead of better. When it comes to violent crime, the ages of offenders seems to be getting younger and younger. Today was, kind of a pivotal day in a sense. We had in court the third of 3 teenage defendants plead guilty in a horrific Garden District rape, kidnapping, robbery, and the ages of those 3 offenders at the time of the crime was 15, 17, and 18. So at the same time, that case is wrapping up, and they got sentences of 30, 35, and 40 years. So substantial sentences for guilty pleas. That was, the crime happened in February. Here we are, October. That case has wrapped up. But just on the heels of that, we had the shooting of a 7-year-old girl and her 31-year-old mom in Hollygrove along Airline Highway after some argument, and they made 2 quick arrests in that case. And I didn't even have to look at the details of the police press release. I said, those are going to be some young shooters. And sure enough, the 2 arrested suspects are 18 and 19 years old. And, when you talk about the crime and punishment, police effectiveness, and the effectiveness of your courts, one thing that is not a part of that equation is how to prevent this from happening in the first place. How do you steer young teenagers from, having the impulse to pick up a gun, to shoot? Once upon a time, disputes were settled with fists, maybe a knife if it really, elevated. And now the first impulse among, usually poor, underclass, marginalized, at-risk youngsters is to pick up a gun. And that's something that is out of the realm of police, out of the realm of judges and courts, and it's really a matter for schools, parents, psychologists, and answers are very elusive, but we at least have pinpointed, when you track the ages of offenders, that they keep getting younger and younger, and here we have a 15-year-old at the time of the crime, 16 when he pleaded to 30 years in prison. His life has barely gotten off the ground before it's now over in the sense of living in the free world.
And that will serve as a kind of a school for them. By the time they get out, they'll be very skilled.
Some would argue that they might come out worse than when they went in.
Well, Errol, storm forecasters have their hands full with a storm coming at us today. They don't always clarify, though, exactly where these storms are going to go, the geography of the area.
Well, listening to the coverage, if you read the reports that come from the Weather Service, it's like they're written by robots, the type of language that they use. They talk in terms of the coordinates and all this. And it's very hard to really make sense of what they're saying. And of course, the people want to know is the hurricane, will be hurricane, it will hit me. And it's really hard to translate those. But I was listening to some of the radio reports, and it just makes me concerned every time we face one of these things that if people don't have a good grasp of the geography, they could easily be misled. For example, if they say there's a chance for a hurricane in southern Jefferson Parish, to a lot of people, southern Jefferson Parish is Airline Highway, all right? And they don't understand that Jefferson Parish goes all the way down to Grand Isle, which is maybe almost 100 miles away. And I almost think that they should specify, Grand Isle as opposed to Jefferson Parish, because it's something totally different. Or if they say that Plaquemines Parish is in danger, from Belle Chase on the top of Plaquemines Parish to Pilot Town is about 90 miles, and it's down in the Gulf. And so I just think that people just need to be very, very specific about what they're talking about, what the chances are. And you just need to realize that some of these outlying parishes have, even though we see them from our everyday lives as suburban parishes, that they have a coastal southern end, and that's where the danger is. And I just think that people are needlessly frightened or perhaps overreacting. And so the people who report the weather just need to be careful how they describe things.
I would think there's also a problem when the forecasters say, well, this was happening in our area, or our area. What is our area? It's a huge
It used to be when they talked
now.
about our area, they were talking about the city of New Orleans, right? And now when they're talking about our area, it could be anywhere from Bogalusa to Grand Isle. And so they could say that heavy thunderstorms in our area, and maybe they're going to be in Madisonville. And so I think they need to be more specific about that too.
Well, Mike, former NOPD Sergeant Arthur Kaufman was released from jail this week. He served time in the Danziger case, but is another trial likely?
Well, we still have to wait for the move that is going to be made by the federal government in this case. With the jury verdicts thrown out, and that was quite controversial. It once all of that settled in, quite a bit of commentary, both for and against the decision by Judge Engelhardt to throw out those verdicts. That yes, there was some prosecutorial misconduct with high-ranking prosecutors writing online comments specifically about the case, but as the advocate pointed out in a really interesting story, there were jurors who came out and said that their jury verdict was not at all affected by any of those online comments. They were under very strict orders to stay away from all media, and did. And that their verdicts were purely based on the facts, testimony, and evidence at that trial.
And of course, at that time, they had no idea that these comments, even if they had read some of them, were being left by prosecutors. They were written by people using pseudonyms.
Now we have a new U.S. attorney in Kenneth Polite, and he will not be making the decision alone. This was prosecuted in conjunction with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. So that's going to be one of his high priority orders of business, is to meet with Justice Department, determine the course of action. Obviously, whenever you have, presumably this will now have to be re-indicted. All of these officers are back to square one, innocent until proven guilty. That's why Kaufman, as a suspect in the case, gets out on his original bond of $100,000. We haven't seen the motions from those other defendants who had been convicted. They're still locked up, and presumably they would also file motions for release, or at least for bond. But this is a time when you may see some talks between the prosecutors and defense attorneys on whether some sort of plea deal can be worked out, rather than put the victims and their families through another trial. And that trial was more than 6 weeks and opened a lot of Katrina wounds.
And it costs a lot of money.
And it's costly at a time of sequesters and government shutdown.
You could see a change of venue motion in this case, even.
Highly likely.
I mean, you could see one granted, because if they want to make absolutely sure that none of the jury pool has been affected by any of this.
There was a change of venue motion in the first trial, rejected, almost out of hand. Those things are rarely granted. And let's face it, you found a jury in the O.J. Simpson trial, you can always find 12 people to be fair and neutral. But in this case, given that the waters were so poisoned by the online comments, that you very well may see that granted.
That was a contention that Kaufman made in asking the Judge Engelhardt, 5-6 months ago, to look into the situation. He felt that he had been the victim of, how did he put it, something like bad public relations on the part of the government.
But it still boils down to this process called voir dire, where you run the jury pool through very strict questionnaire and grilling from both prosecution and defense on, if they have formed any opinion about the case. And many of them have, and they get weeded out, put on the sidelines. And sometimes voir dire can, be extended into overtime, as it will, and bring in, more jurors for that pool until you do find that panel of 12 who swears under oath that they can be fair and impartial. And you can almost always find that. You can almost always find that without fail. And from the comments of those two jurors who spoke out after the Engelhardt ruling, it looks like you did have it in this case, but Engelhardt, in a 129-page ruling, made the call, and there's no going back on it now.
Is there any indication how Polite is going to deal with this?
They've been completely silent because this is a black eye for both this U.S. Attorney's Office and the whole Department of Justice. One of the Civil Rights Division attorneys who came to help in the case to protect the rights of the officers also admitted being one of the online commenters. So the poison traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. The result is that there's been this cone of silence, including a report that was, I guess, still in progress on, all of this scandal and whether there will be disciplinary action on those prosecutors who commented.
Before we hear of that, Errol, what do you see that we ought to look for?
October 19th, Election Day. Most of the elections here are small judicial elections or to fill vacancies. Upstate Louisiana is going to be a huge election day because there's going to be a congressional election. But if you want to vote early voting starts tomorrow.
Mike?
Okay, all eyes are on the New Orleans Saints, of course, with their undefeated start, but maybe not as well noticed is the fact that the Pelicans, the New Orleans Pelicans, formerly the Hornets, started their training camp. You're going to have at least 3/5 of that starting lineup fresh faces. Hope springs eternal. So, it's going to be a very, very interesting and maybe pivotal season for that franchise.
Well, are they going to be on the court or in a hospital?
Well, they're coming in almost completely healthy, and the pundits are saying playoff potential.
Tyler?
Yeah, we're going to do a follow-up on the story that we did on Kabakov in downtown New Orleans. We're going to take, at the Lens, we're going to take the charity part. On Monday, we're going to invite readers to offer their idea for how charity should be transformed. And then we'll be doing a live chat on Tuesday about that. So maybe some folks can come up with some better ideas than what the mayor or Pres Kabakov is proposing for what should happen to the now vacant charity building.
Gordon?
I'm going to boldly predict that this storm is going to be a shoo-shoo, so that's all knock on wood.
A shoo-shoo? I don't know that phrase.
Oh, shoo-shoo. You guys don't know that one?
Yeah,
It's
How about shoe like go away?
it's a Cajun term for a firecracker that doesn't explode, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got to do a shoo-shoo here. Thanks all for being with us. You've exploded here tonight for us very well. Thank you for being with us on Informed Sources. Be back again next week. Good night.